When you read through the 5 books of Moses, you will read that some events occurred on a specific day. But some of them sound unrealistic. For example, Moses allegedly conducted an entire census in a single day. Undertaking a census of thousands of people is unlikely to have been completed in one day. Many scholars have questioned the dates of the flood account, and if it would be possible for a massive deluge to completely dry in a mere year. Because of these issues and others, many suggest the Pentateuch is filled with errors. It gives unrealistic time frames for many events, and so it's likely mythology. But we must remember the Pentateuch was not written with our modern cultural expectations. It was written in a culture that could speak about historical events, but use dates and numbers within the narrative in a symbolic fashion or for other purposes. Michael Lefebvre has argued that when it comes to the dates of the Pentateuch, they were not given for historical time markers, but for liturgical reasons. In other words, some of the historical events of the Pentateuch were placed on specific dates to help remind Israel of important festivals, and not to suggest they necessarily occurred on that day. Let's look at some interesting examples. Deuteronomy says it was exactly 6 months after Aaron's death that Moses stood before Israel to deliver his final message. But the problem is, if these dates are historical, there would not have been enough time for all the events to transpire that Numbers records. The people remained at Mount Nor to mourn for Aaron for 30 days. This leaves 5 months for Moses to have led the people over 350 miles around Edom and Moab, engage in 3 military operations, deal with the serpent issue, get through the events with Balaam, conduct a second census, resolve the inheritance dilemma, call a national assembly for Joshua's and Eleazar's appointments, receive and teach more on festival sacrificial laws, teach on laws about vows, and give final instructions about the conquest and settlement. As Michael Lefebvre says, that is a lot to squeeze into 6 months between Aaron's death and Moses' sermon, if the dates are intended as literal data. A similar issue arises when we look at how quickly Israel erected the tabernacle. Exodus 40 says the tabernacle was completed on the first day of the first month of the second year after Israel came out of Egypt. For simplicity, let's just say this was April 1st. The Israelites left Egypt on the 15th day of that first month, which would mean they left around April 15th of the prior year. They arrived at Sinai in the 3rd month. For now, let's just say that was June 1st to give them the maximal amount of time. There are a total of 90 days mentioned concerning events that occurred at Sinai. There are other events mentioned without time, and based on reasonable estimates, Lefebvre says that we should add 2 additional months, which would place Israel at Sinai for around 5 months, bringing them to November 1st on our calendar. Then after this, God instructs them to create the tabernacle, which would give them 5 months to complete a monumental task. That would leave only 5 months to collect, sort, and organize all the gold, silver, yarns, skins, and other raw materials for the tabernacle, for Moses to communicate the instructions to Bezalel and Oholiab, and for the actual construction of all the parts, furnishings, utensils of the tabernacle to be completed, using whatever furnaces and other equipment they could assemble in the wilderness, all while observing a Sabbath rest each week. It would be remarkable for such a massive project to be completed so efficiently, even with modern manufacturing and construction technologies. In the 1940s, H.G. Baldwin constructed a replica of the tabernacle. Even in a post-industrial world, it still took him 5 years. Of course, one could say the Israelites had divine help, but the authors never suggested such a thing occurred for either of the sequences we mentioned. And the Pentateuch is not short on miracles. The implication is the events in Numbers and the construction of the tabernacle all occurred by natural human means, even though this likely would have been impossible in the short time spans listed. Because of this, many suggest the Pentateuch is various sources that were stitched together. The redactor didn't realize the dates he was listing were creating impossible time frames. But Michael Lefebvre notes the problem is the dates were not intended for historical datum, but were given for liturgical guidance. And when we realize this, the dates actually make sense as key features of the unified narrative. As noted in prior videos, time frames and numbers in the Bible and in the ancient Near East were often not meant to be understood as literal. They could have symbolic purposes, or were used for other means besides chronology. Sacha Stern said, "Years, months, weeks, and days are not really units of pure time, but only calendrical categories that represent the duration or length of either astronomical and seasonal processes, or socially sanctioned cycles of human activity." We should keep this in mind when we look at numbers in the biblical texts. There are 21 dated events in the Pentateuch. Only 4 do not directly fall on festival days, and all 4 of those fall within a 2-week window. The rest all fall on a festival day or a new moon. We see that 4 dates align with New Year's Day, when Noah removed the cover from the ark, the first Passover, the completion of the tabernacle, and the transition from the Exodus generation to the next one. Each of these events marks a new beginning, so it would make sense for the authors to place them on New Year's Day to correspond to new beginnings. There are 7 dates associated with the Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. Most refer to the first Passover, but serve as a subtle reminder of when to observe and keep the Passover. The Festival of Booths was meant to remind Israel of their safe journey through the wilderness. One recorded event corresponds to this, which is when Noah's Ark came to rest on the mountains. It is likely that Noah's safe journey was recorded as ending on the Festival of Booths to remind Israel of their own safe journey. Exodus 19:1 says, "In the 3rd month after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai." Scholars have questioned why no specific day was recorded, especially given that arriving at Sinai was an important point. But Lefebvre notes it is not meant to record the exact day, but to remind readers of the Festival of Weeks. This festival was not on a specific day, but was determined by counting 7 weeks from the Feast of First Fruits. If the author was thinking of this festival, it would make sense to only say they arrived at some time in the 3rd month. It was therefore the day, which always took place in the 3rd month, but was not identified by a specific day number. Exodus 19:1 therefore avoids giving a specific day number in keeping with the liturgical calendar. The unusual date form in Exodus 19:1 supports the thesis of this essay. The Pentateuch is not concerned with precise historical dates, but with assigning dates that connect historical events with the liturgical calendar. The Festival of Weeks also required that Israelites present themselves before God and make a grain offering. This corresponds to the historical event of the Israelites arriving at Sinai to present themselves before God. Besides the events that correspond to the new year, 4 events are placed on new moon days and correspond to important points for calendrical reminders. One is when the mountaintops became visible to Noah, but this date corresponds to the midpoint between the final harvest festival and the first harvest festival of the new year. In the flood account, the waters had fully receded during the spring harvest festival, and so this date appears to represent the midpoint of the flood waters receding in the story of Noah, and corresponds to a midpoint for the Israelite calendar. Moses conducted a census on the 2nd new moon festival, which corresponds to the first new moon festival after the New Year's Day celebration, and could have served as a reminder to continue the new moon sacrifices after the New Year festival. Aaron's death is also dated to a new moon festival, which is at the midpoint of the summer, and is exactly between the Festival of Weeks and Booths. Moses then dies exactly 6 months after this, at the midpoint of winter, which was 2.5 months before Passover. These dates were not recorded to give exact chronology, but were used for liturgical purposes to help Israel remember festivals, upcoming festivals, and important rituals. As noted earlier, there are 4 dated events that do not fall on any festival or new moon. In the 2nd month, starting on the 15th day, Israel was taught to work for 6 days and rest on the 7th. The flood began on the 17th day of the 2nd month, Israel finished their first census and left for Mount Sinai on the 20th day, and ground was completely dry for Noah on the 27th day. Lefebvre notes this 2-week period falls between the 2 spring harvest festivals and has connections to the harvest season in Canaan. First fruits marked the beginning of the grain festival, and the festival of weeks in the 3rd month marked its end. It makes sense that during this period, they should have been reminded that Israel worked for 6 days collecting manna and then rested on the 7th. The analogy between gathering grain and gathering manna would make memorable the lesson to trust the Lord, to bless the harvest, even if laborers abstain from collection on the Sabbath. The dating of the beginning and the end of the flood during this period also makes sense with the weather of Canaan. It was normal for the Jordan to flood during this time, due to the winter rainfalls pouring in from the surrounding hills and mountains. The flood account does well to correspond to liturgical aspects of the Israelite calendar when floods would begin and cease. And finally, the last date was when Israel departed for Sinai, which was in the midst of the harvest season. This could have served to remind Israel to prepare to offer grain before the Lord during the upcoming Festival of Weeks, just as Israel left to present themselves before God at Sinai. Now, this is not to say all the dates in the Pentateuch are necessarily inaccurate. Some of the events recorded, like the first Passover, were probably accurate and inspired the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The author may have highlighted certain dates because they corresponded well, and then ignored dates that did not. The point is, however, that the author's main concern was not to get exact dating correct, but to use events to teach and remind about liturgical aspects. They had different concerns than we do. This also doesn't mean the events they wrote about are not historical. It seems more likely they wrote about historical events while assigning dates for liturgical reasons. We cannot fall into the false dichotomy of it either being entirely literal or entirely mythical. But additionally, given this liturgical understanding, we can see the authors had good reasons to choose the dates they did. It is not necessarily the case that dates of the Pentateuch came about from later redactors stitching together multiple sources. As Lefebvre says, there is a pervasive liturgical interest behind the 21 dates spread through the Pentateuch. From this perspective, it can be seen that there is, in fact, remarkable congruity among the Pentateuch's dates, but it is liturgical, not historical congruity. Rather than it being a patchwork of various sources stitched together, the evidence suggests the Pentateuch was shaped for liturgical concerns. The historical narratives were part of this unifying structure that went along with festival dates. This data is consistent with the idea the Pentateuch has a unifying structure that cannot be divided into different sources. You made it to the end of this video, which means this message matters to you. If you want to see more content like this reaching people for Christ, you can help make it happen. Your support makes these videos possible. Click the link below and donate today. And if you want to go even deeper, consider joining our Patreon community. You'll get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, and a place to connect with others passionate about this mission.